Much anticipated Quad summit, which was scheduled in Sydney next week, has now been cancelled. The US President Joe Biden had to cut short his trip to Asia to deal with the debt crisis back at home. Biden had been planning to travel to Sydney for the Quad summit as part of a week-long Asia tour, which includes the G7 summit in Hiroshima and a significant stopover in Papua New Guinea for a meeting with Pacific Island leaders. After the late-hour cancellation, Biden will just attend the G7 summit and fly to sit for the back debt ceiling negotiations in Washington. According to Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, the Quad leaders would instead have discussions in Japan. So that doesn't mean that there will be no meet at all. In fact, it will happen not in Australia but in Japan, where all four leaders would be present over the weekend. President Joe Biden trademark pledge, America is back, is looking a little shaky at the moment, especially after the cancellation of Quad meeting and the significant stopover in Papua New Guinea, the capital Port Moresby. It's been touted as an international embarrassment that will not go unnoticed by China. From small Pacific Island nations to the territory of Guam, the United States has been trying to increase its military footprint across the Indo-Pacific, only to bolster a line of defense against an increasingly assertive China. The Chinese military already has gained access to the Solomon Islands, plus the pact between China and the Solomon Islands. Their terms, negotiations and details on the military activities lack transparency and clarity. Such an alliance now could pose a threat to Guam and to Australia, which of course, as we know, is a key US ally. Although the cancellation of his trip is seen as a setback for America's foreign policy, Biden's shifting priorities is being hailed ahead of the upcoming presidential election next year.
I'm cutting my trip short. I'm postponing the Australia portion of the trip and my stop in Papua New Guinea in order to be back for the final negotiations with congressional leaders. And I spoke today with Prime Minister Albanese of Australia and a short time ago and let him know what was going on. There was an overwhelming consensus, I think, in today's meeting of the congressional leaders that defaulting on the debt is simply not an option. Our economy would fall into recession. It would devastate retirement accounts, increase borrowing costs, and according to Moody's, nearly 8 million Americans would lose their jobs and our international reputation would be damaged in the extreme if we were to let that happen.
The Quad leaders meeting will not be going ahead in Sydney next week. We, though, will be having that discussion between Quad leaders in Japan. I thank Prime Minister Kishida for his invitation for me to attend the G7, and it is appropriate that we talk.
Now, Joe Biden has found himself caught in a catch-22 situation. The political risks of Biden leaving the country 2 weeks before a potentially damaging financial crisis are high. And if talks founder over the next few days, Republicans will likely accuse him of caring more about hanging out with foreigners than Americans. Back at home, Biden assures that the negotiators would continue to make progress on avoiding a default. But the House Speaker, Kevin McCarthy, claims that the two sides remained far apart on an agreement to lift the debt ceiling.
We just finished another good, productive meeting with our congressional leadership about a path forward to make sure that America does not default on its debt. Well, there's still work to do, but I made it clear to the Speaker and others that we'll speak regularly over the next several days, and the staff's going to continue meeting daily to make sure we do not default. I'm confident we're going to continue to make progress toward avoiding default and fulfilling America's responsibility as a leader on the world stage. There was an overwhelming consensus, I think, in today's meeting of the congressional leaders that defaulting on the debt is simply not an option. Our economy would fall into recession. It would devastate retirement accounts, increase borrowing costs, and according to Moody's, nearly 8 million Americans would lose their jobs and our international reputation would be damaged in the extreme if we were to let that happen. It's disappointing that our discussions in the congressional Republicans have not been willing to discuss raising revenues, but the policy differences between the parties should not stop Congress from avoiding default. I made clear again today's meeting that default is not an option. America pays its debts, pays its bills, and there will be plenty of time to debate the policy differences. but the country we've never defaulted on our debt, and we never will.
I think we set the stage to carry on further conversations. We only have 15 days really to go. We've got to find a way that we can curve our spending, raise our debt limit, and also grow our economy. And the president agreed to appoint a couple people from his administration to sit down and negotiate directly with my team, so I found that to be productive personally. But we've got a lot of work to do in a short amount of time. It is possible to get a deal by the end of the week. It's not that difficult to get to an agreement.
The bottom line is that we all came to agreement that we were going to continue discussions in the way that I believe Speaker McCarthy described, which was agreed to by all of us in the room together. And hopefully we can come to an agreement. We don't have much time, but default is just the worst alternative. And having a bipartisan bill in both chambers is the only way we're going to avoid default. Hakeem and I are committed to trying to get that bipartisan bill done.
All right, so can the United States avoid a default situation? Also, what sort of an impact will this have as far as the United States and its diplomatic relations are concerned? Let's try and delve deeper. And for that, let me also introduce my guests. I'm joined in by Sarang Shidor, who's the Director of Studies and Senior Research Fellow at the Quincy Institute. Thank you, Sarang, for joining in. Also joining me is Mr. John Quelch, who's the former Dean of Miami Herbert Business School. Thank you so much, John, for joining in. John, if I may begin with you. This negotiation is on the budget, not whether to default. That's what President Joe Biden has just said in the recent comments that we are breaking right now. What does President Biden mean when he says that? Does that mean the debt ceiling is non-negotiable and that a separate budget process will be required?
Just to give you some background, the debt was $3 trillion in the United States in 1989. It's increased tenfold in the last 33 years to now $31.4 trillion. And what we're looking at the moment is a budget deficit this year of $1.54 trillion. The Republicans have already passed a bill earlier this year that would increase the debt ceiling by $1.5 trillion, but tied to a number of requirements in terms of government savings. Normally, the debt ceiling is raised in a clean fashion without being tied to obligations around revenues or reductions in government expenditures. On this occasion, because the Republicans now control the U.S. House of Representatives, they're playing hardball with the White House to try and extract some concessions. That's the background that we're looking at here.
Right, and when I asked you, what does he mean when he says that that's non-negotiable? Are we looking at a separate budget process?
What we're looking at here is, first of all, the debt ceiling has to be raised. Both the president and the Republicans agree with that. What is at stake is the side deal that will be negotiated to facilitate a clean passage of the budget deficit increase. So that side bill is what is on the table in terms of the negotiations between the White House representatives and the Republican representatiors. The White House also represented by, of course, the leader of the Senate and the leader of the Democratic minority in the House of Representatives. So all of these people are agreed on the end result. The question is the horse trading, how the sausage is going to be made over the next 2 weeks, who's going to get what. But both sides will need to come out to the microphones to be able to claim some kind of victory to their supporters.
Right. In fact, we'll try and delve deeper into who's going to get what. In the meantime, Sarang, let's also come to the diplomatic impact of the debt ceiling crisis. What's the message being sent out abroad with Biden now cancelling the Papua New Guinea and Australian legs of his trip?
Thank you for having me. There's certainly a message being sent, and the message is that of unreliability of sorts. This doesn't really help the United States' reputation when the president's commitment to attending a fairly major series of events is cut short, and two of the three events are those that he will not join, and that too at the last minute. So I think there is a short-term reputational cost.
Right.
On the other hand, we should also realize that some of the substantive work that was going to be done, for example, in the Quad Summit, will probably still be done, because the four leaders will meet in Hiroshima in Japan on the sidelines of the G7 meeting. And if that goes through as is expected, they will probably have a substantive discussion. So in terms of the Quad's agenda and that conversation, that's likely to move forward. But I think the way this looks, the optics of it is not great.
Right. John, if I could bring you in on this, certainly the optics of it, as Sarang just mentioned, do not look too good. But having said that, would it be fair to say that this is just the debt crisis is an issue that should just be limited to the wrangling within the US Congress? Because everybody is wondering what this default could mean, not just for the United States, but also for the world.
Well, for the United States, the default would be catastrophic. Because it would result in an immediate lack of confidence in the markets. The interest rates would soar, affecting consumer borrowing costs, and the contagion would spread quickly internationally. So there's no doubt that as the major reserve currency in the world, the currency that 85% of all international transactions are settled in, the US dollar, it cannot afford to lose credibility and lose trust through a default. So that's simply not going to happen. I mean, on the political front, I would say, while agreeing with Salam that every elected political leader at some point or another usually has a domestic problem that results in some change in international travel plans. I would not read too much into this. It's a little bit embarrassing, but what's more embarrassing is the fact that this problem pops up every year. And we need a better budgeting process in the United States to avoid the constant annual charade of this, down to the wire negotiation.
I'm in fact going to take my next question based on how frequently this has been happening. But before that, let me come to Sarang. Sarang, at a time when China is taking on the mantle of playing global peacemaker in Ukraine after the recent Saudi-Iran deal, their representative is already on a tour to Ukraine and Russia as we speak. How do you assess the geopolitical outcome of Biden's decision to cancel the Quad meet, a grouping that in fact was created to counter China's clout in the Indo-Pacific?
Right. So here I would say that the structural, longer-term, deeper impacts of one visit being cancelled, where the substantive meeting anyway will likely be held, is not large. So essentially, this is again perception, optics, impact. Of course, I'm assuming that there will not be a default. If there's a default, there are substantial material impacts, as our other guest has laid out. But assuming that this is just a cancellation of a single summit in Australia and the work continues, I don't think this will have a major impact in terms of the question you asked, that there are other issues that are much more important than Biden not showing up in Australia.
Plenty of scenarios are publicly and privately being debated and gamed out, but no one knows for sure. Just how does this debt limit standoff end? What are the possibilities that you see through your experience?
So I think that there are two or three things that have already essentially been agreed upon. There is around about a $58 billion figure attached to unspent relief money that was voted by the Congress as part of the COVID relief package, but that has not yet been spent by state governments in the US, and that can be clawed back. There's also a strong interest in accelerating and easing permitting processes for infrastructure projects, especially energy infrastructure, which both parties have agreed upon as being a very high priority for the US, having passed a significant infrastructure bill last year. So there are definitely areas of agreement that I think have already been arrived at. Where the Democrats are always very reluctant to allow backsliding is in the case of legislation that they have passed in the last couple of years that represent their legislative achievements. And going into the 2024 election, President Biden can't afford to be giving up or be seen to be giving up on achievements that he has marked up in the last 2 to 3 years. So I think that that's where there's going to be the rub. I think it is going to come down to the wire or close to the wire. And that is why the president has underscored the importance of getting back to Washington for the last 7 days before the alleged June 1 deadline, which may or may not actually be the actual deadline. It might,
but still, it's in fact just a fortnight away. And as you rightly mentioned, this is a very crucial year for the United States because, as we all know, the US is headed into election next year.